And we're going to shift gears a little bit now. We've been talking about the history of protest. The next two speakers are going to be addressing current efforts to protest the war. Our first member of that group is Graham Clumpner, who did not send me a biography, but I can tell you what I know about it. He's a veteran of the Iraq War, I believe, and an active member of Iraq Veterans Against the War. He's also a member of the volunteer board of Coffee Strong, a pro-GI anti-war resource center located adjacent to Joint Base Lewis McChord. Currently a student at Evergreen, and you're pursuing what degree?
Master's in Environmental Studies.
Okay, so please welcome Graham Clumpner.
We've heard this term GI and GI resistance throughout the whole process, and I just wanted to point out the word GI means government issue. So from the perspective of the US military, a GI is a piece of equipment. So that's important to remember throughout this process. So when 9/11 happened, I was 17 years old, and much like some of the other folks in this panel, I wanted to give back to my country. I had been raised on Black Hawk Down and Saving Private Ryan and the 50th or 60th anniversary of World War II and all these ideas about what it meant to be a man in our culture. And as an only child who has no military history in my family, there wasn't really a narrative one way or the other to tell me what to do with myself after 9/11. And if you remember, if you're old enough to remember what Bush said, there was two options to give back to your country. One was to join the US military, and the other was to go to Disneyland or go shopping. So I was never too much on the shopping part, and I liked the outdoors, and I thought I would like to shoot a gun, so I enlisted in the U.S. Army. And it was so popular at that time that I had to wait a year just to be able to go to training. And once I attended training, I began to start wondering, there was so much internal abuse towards each other and turning us against each other in the training process, that I began to maybe not question the wars themselves. By this point, this is 2003, and we had just invaded Iraq. We had been in Afghanistan for almost 2 years, and I was questioning whether or not the effectiveness of our approach was working. And I definitely had questions about how we were approaching Iraq. It didn't seem very strategic for me. It wasn't about the people. It wasn't some humanitarian perspective. It seemed kind of stupid to attack people that, to me, clearly had nothing to do with 9/11. If you ever read a single book, you would understand that. And the American people trusted, a lot of us trusted our leaders, the adults, the people at the wheel, to show us the right way. And even though 10 million people marched in the streets on February 18th, 2003, all across the world, largest world gathering in human history against the war, including San Francisco shutting its city down completely, places like Olympia and Seattle and Madison and Denver and Oakland, just tons of resistance. Despite that, it didn't get news coverage. It didn't allow us practical alternatives to war. So when we finally got in a discussion about okay, so Saddam is a bad person, Bin Laden's a bad person, we need to get these people, these terrorists, the left in our country didn't have an alternative. It was no war. And it's interesting because it's the same thing we've been struggling with when it comes to climate change. No more fossil fuels, no more, and we don't have these alternatives of what the other road is. And so in a lot of ways we get dismissed. So I wanted to just tell a little bit about my experience leaving the military and then kind of sum up a few ideas about resistance. I'd always looked at veterans as this. I mean, had I met any of the folks on this panel that are vets prior to my service, I would have stopped my car, gotten out, went over, shook your hand, and thanked you for your service. And now when someone does that to me, exact opposite response. So in 2005, I deployed to Afghanistan. And at that point, Afghanistan was the good war. It was supposedly the calm war. And we had already won that war, and it was just a process of us mopping up and cleaning up. I was part of a Army unit called the 75th Ranger Regiment. I was stationed at Fort Lewis And my job was to jump out of airplanes at the beginning of a war and take over the airfields. If you take the airfields, then you can fly your own planes in, bring tanks, extra equipment, and food. After you do that, you can't keep taking the airfields, right? So once you own the airfields, you got to switch your mission. And our mission then switched to snatch and grab or direct action missions. So essentially imagine a SWAT team in the United States, but overseas. And imagine that SWAT team not speaking the language. Imagine that SWAT team not understanding the culture. Imagine that SWAT team never having been on that block, never operated in that city before, and going into people's houses at 3 in the morning, because that is when scientists and psychologists that the US military hired tell us that's when people are most vulnerable. That's when you're most groggy. That's when you're least likely to respond and resist to a home invasion. So we would take people out of their beds based on intelligence that had been passed on to us. Sometimes it was electronic intercepts, like phone calls. Sometimes it was personal conversations. But most of the time it was people settling scores and using the US military to settle them for them. So you had opposite tribes or people who had some feud going back a long time, and they'd call up the Americans and say, hey, Al-Qaeda's over in that house over there. And we'd be like, let's go get them. So a lot of the times we would roll up the wrong people. And when we did have an accurate address, a lot of the times people weren't at the house. So I was part of a unit that in our folklore of American history is considered to be one of the most efficient, one of the most well-funded and historically significant units. And yet we were unable to perform our jobs to the extent that the United States movie industry had informed me that we did. How many of y'all have seen American Sniper? Anybody in this room seen American Sniper? That is a fucked up movie. But those types of memes, those types of narratives in our culture create this idea of, even in losing battles, that the American soldier is an honorable person who is trying to do the right thing despite the politicians or despite the circumstances, the political circumstances. And what I found in my experience was this devolution of our souls. So some people talk about training in the US military as a dehumanization process. And that is true to the extent that they dehumanize us as Americans. But to the extent that Afghans or Iraqis or Vietnamese or Somalis or Yemenis or Pakistanis or Syrians, to list all the countries we have or currently are bombing, it requires someone to be human in the first place to be dehumanized. And we don't consider those people human to begin with. So it was a very easy step to go to the point of calling people ragheads and camel jockeys and sand niggers and goat ropers. It was a very easy process to look at a silhouette of a black human being and point and shoot at those targets over and over and over. Muscle memory creating a lack of thought. To take those neurons and skip one of them and go straight from like reaction to action. And it wasn't until years after the military, after 2007, when I left, that I started really processing this. Because it's survival. You're trying to go through the motions. You have a million tasks to do every day, but yet you're bored as hell. And the last thing you want to do is think about the experience that you're having. So when my time came up after 4 years, I knew that I was done with the US military. And so I left. I didn't know what to do with my life, and somehow my parents convinced me to stumble into college, ass backwards and drunk. I was waking up every morning, putting whiskey in my coffee, and basically letting my day progress downward from there. And I was rescued about 1.5 years out of the military in a very unique way. My father, right after the election of our anti-war president, Barack Obama, my father received a letter in the mail on November 11th, which is Veterans Day, that I was being recalled to active duty service for a 1.5 year deployment to Iraq, and he was crying. And that is not something that my father has ever done before. And so I was thrust into this position of having to not only make a moral choice about my direction in my life and actually relive and refocus on the behaviors that I've already participated in, but also to take care of my family in a way, the emotional burden of like carrying my friends and family. And during that process, I had worked, up until that point, I had worked for the Obama campaign, and I had participated in Democratic politics. And I learned something really unique when I got recalled to the US military. And that was the party members, and not all of them, of course, but the party members that I had worked with, when I went to them, when I went to congressmen and senators that I'd worked for in Wisconsin and said, here's the situation, I need your help, they're trying to send me back to Iraq. To a T, they told me that I had signed a piece of paper and that it was my obligation to go back there. And these are the same motherfuckers that signed that war so they could send not their kids over there, but other people's kids. So that was a major break for me when that support didn't exist among the people supposedly it was supposed to. And I began to ask questions. I began to discover Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. I began to reach out in a different way. And I made a decision no matter what, whether I went to jail, whether I went to Canada, whatever, I was not going back. And that led to the political process that has me sitting here today. And I think it's interesting. I think I noticed how many young men there are in the room. And I think that's interesting because usually political events, I find much more young women than I find young men. And I also find a lot of women between 50 and 75. How many of the young men here are students right now? Okay, so if this is 1967, 1968, your teachers are a large determinant of whether or not you get drafted. If you fail out of college right now, you fail one of your classes, you get drafted. You're on the first ticket over to Vietnam. That does not exist for this generation. Because after Vietnam, the US military took a look at itself and said, we had 600,000 American soldiers go to Canada, go to jail, refuse, frag their officers, and say, we're not participating in this. And the military made a determination thinking that was because of the draft, that was because people were connected in their communities. And so the military shifted to an all-volunteer military.
Oh, no, a lot of people stood down in Olympia, all over the United States, stood in silent vigil against the draft. That's very significant.
Right.
My mother stood in silent vigil.
There was absolute resistance to that, and the military's tactical shift to overcome that in 1976 was to switch to an all-volunteer military. And they added all these kinds of benefits. So for example, if you have a child in the military now, you get full health benefits. If you're serving in the military and your spouse or your children want to go to college, they can go to college for free. If you have a kid in the military, you are staying in the military because there's no other way you're going to walk out and find those kinds of social structures. If you are a working class person in America, you can immediately become middle class by joining the US military. So they made these shifts that forced a certain segment of working class segment of the American population to have little to no alternatives when they graduate high school. Do I want to go into college? I sucked in high school, I struggled, I hated it, or I can go into the military and actually get some money for student loans or get things paid off. So the circumstances of GI resistance today versus during Vietnam is very, very different because a lot of the time when I talk to civilians and folks in the United States, people say things like, well, you enlisted. Why should I feel sorry for you? Why should I support your resistance if you chose to be in that situation? And I would point out one of the interesting things about the Vietnam War is that the initial GI resistance started from enlistees, people who had volunteered for the military, who felt betrayed by their government. And there is an interesting thing about betrayal. That's a key part of trauma. So trauma comes when betrayal exists. Trauma is something that all of us in this culture are facing. Peter talked about capitalism before. There's been trauma long before capitalism existed, but it finds a really fascinating way to specialize it, and it becomes intergenerational. So we hear these things like the World War II vets came home and they just got back to work, right? They got back down to it and built America. Yeah, they also came home and beat their wives and beat their kids. They also created the institutions that sent us to Korea, sent us to Vietnam, sent us to Iraq, and sent us to Afghanistan. How many people in here know a veteran? I mean, being associated with those wars overseas, when those folks come home, they bring that trauma with them. And so a lot of the work that I've been trying to do is recruit, unionize, educate active duty soldiers and personnel and veterans when they come back and help them take responsibility for their own trauma, for their own experiences, and try to help. Try to help change the process, because our goal is to create a world where there are no veterans.
Yes.
Like, we're trying to abolish ourselves. And so there's a lot of work that's happening in this region right now around connecting climate change and militarism, because as the military tells us, all future wars are climate wars. And if we want to understand how we're going to build a world that holds up all of the values that I know the folks in this room have, we have to be part of the peace movement first and foremost. Because these militaristic policies are what prevent us from actually addressing social inequality. So I look forward to talking more afterwards, but there's a lot of campaigns going on right now that folks in this room can participate in, and I look forward to hearing what work you all are doing so we can actually come together and start connecting more. Thank you very much.